Well, I like that you used the term roped in, because I have to say I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but it was really enjoyable. I found that I had many more resources than I was used to in the private sector. Many more resources in the form of people and funding and the breadth of the sort of power that you have to get things done. And I think a lot of the lifelong bureaucrats, and I don't say that in a negative way, but people that have been in government their entire careers may not have recognized the sort of span of control and change that they could affect on people in short order. And so I would encourage somebody new coming in to, first of all, not be intimidated by the fact that they may not have the requisite resume or have come from 20 or 30 years of background in government. I also think we're getting away from the sort of white male, or as we say, some of my female counterparts in the U.S. would say, pale, male, and stale. Where we need more diversity, if you will, in leadership. We need people that are younger. Not that we don't need older people, but I'm just saying we need sometimes people that are younger. We need more females in positions of power. And so I would encourage people to hire a diverse group of people around them. I would encourage them to assess their budgets very quickly and understand where the money's coming from and what levers they have to increase resources where they might need it, let's say for active transportation. I think that honest, transparent communication with people, that's where you articulate what your vision is, and you're very real about it. It's very important. People can sort of smell dishonesty. And I think one of the things that I tried to do is to put together a marketing plan that was basically based on what we were really trying to do, which was to make our cities safer, to make people healthier, to make our cities more sustainable, to design for children, disabled people, older people, and to create economic, growth. The streets are engines of prosperity, or they can be. And those are really some of the keys. There's much more, and people can read my book, but I think that those are some of the key things that I would recommend. So yes, coming from the startup world, I'm a big fan of experimentation, pivoting your product or service, involving the public in selecting what works. But having said that, when we say pilots or experiments, we really mean typically a controlled experiment, whereby you look at the current state, you look at the state you want to get to. Let's say, for example, you have 1% of people riding a bike in a corridor, and you'd like to get to 2%. And you do a controlled experiment where you say, okay, we're going to take a lane of traffic from automobiles, which in the case I'm thinking of, there were 5 lanes of one-way auto traffic. We're going to give 1 lane to bikes, and we're going to move the parking over, and we're going to do it for a year. We're going to see how it works. We're going to measure before, during, and after average daily traffic and speeds, and whether it's overall safer for pedestrians and cyclists. And in this particular experiment that I'm thinking of, at the end of the year, we came back and we'd been talking to the community throughout, but at the end they said, hey, this is working actually much better than we thought. We like that cars are slowing down in our neighborhood. Like, that's more important to us than offering cycling to people coming through our neighborhood. But overall, we like it. What we have noticed is that people are riding their bikes the wrong way. So could you make this a two-way bike lane? And we had thought about it, but their feedback was very valuable in making the decision to make it a two-way bike facility. And so in these controlled experiments, if you make your stakeholders, whether it be the mayors or the council members or the business shopkeepers or the landowners or the residents, you make them part of the sort of diagnosis of whether the experiment is working, and you'll find they give you a lot longer leash to play with. Now, in terms of your question of cost, you know, tactical urbanism projects, which I think we're going to talk about later, they can be extremely cheap. They can be somewhere in the middle or more expensive. It really depends on what your budget is, how long you plan on leaving it in place. And, you know, we've done, for instance, little pop-up plazas for as little as $1,000, and we've done them for $70,000. And in terms of showing people that it can be used for something different, you can accomplish it for $1,000. In terms of showing people something that you feel like they might want to make permanent, you may want to spend some more money. Or in some cases, you may need a different level of infrastructure for safety. But we have shown, like in the US, that putting up plastic bollards is very effective in keeping cars away from cyclists or pedestrians. And so you don't need to pour concrete everywhere you go. And if your standard is always Cadillac, you know, or platinum standard for every piece of infrastructure, you'll never experiment. So basically, I guess to sum it up, I'm saying that because it's a pilot doesn't mean it's by the seat of the pants necessarily, but you can put together plans for quick iteration so that you can execute them over and over in different contexts for different types of purposes, right? And you can do them on the cheap. You can spend a little bit more money if you think it's probably going to become permanent. And you know, whether it's Times Square, some of the bike facilities I've done, pop-up plazas, alley reinventions, a lot of the stuff you see in the U.S. Are these quick iteration, sort of disruptive pilots. And I would also argue on the fiscal piece that what I've learned is it's typically much more fiscally responsible to pilot something and show people how it works, get their buy-in. We did that with our parking system in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. We had a series of 8 different pilots going before we committed millions and millions of taxpayer dollars to actually commit to a system. We first tested to make sure it worked. So I actually think that you can make an argument that it's much more fiscally responsible in some cases to do the pilot or the controlled experiment before you go to a full procurement. I also talk in the book about areas that we failed. So if you don't mind, I'm going to first talk about the introduction of Lyft and Uber in the United States and how government, in many cases, said, you know what, we're not going to engage with you right now on that. We're not going to entertain the idea of this competition for our taxi system, and just come back later when we're ready. And what's interesting about technology and some of these new business models is that they're very hard to regulate. Once you open the Pandora's box of the internet, and let's use Uber as an example, because I know you have Uber here, you have government saying, well, we don't want Uber to come to the airport. But practically speaking, how do you actually stop it? Because it's an unmarked car, right? And it's dropping somebody off. How can you tell if it's not somebody's mom or dad or friend? So it becomes very hard to regulate. And then on top of it, you have a very smart consumer typically who wants better service and lower prices and a technology-enabled solution. So I would say that in the US, we did a rather poor job Although I would also say that some of the technology companies did a poor job in how they approach government. On the upside, it's been a real learning for both sides for the future. And I think that you now have a lot of government agencies saying, well, wait a second, how do we actually leverage that service, that business model, that tool to further our own goals, which might be to increase transit use on our fixed guideway system, our MRT. And is there a way to use a service like that as a feeder? Or is there a way to maybe get rid of some really low quality suburban service that we have that's not really serving people equitably and substitute in one of these business models? So next you look at autonomous cars on the horizon. And actually I should say autonomous technology, because there will be a lot of applications. And far too often people just think of the Google pod. There will be autonomous buses, and there are autonomous trains already. We already have autonomous airplanes. I mean, airplanes really are the original autonomous shared mobility service, right? And so you're just applying that to robotaxi, to bus, to lots of other things. And so I think that government is much more open-minded now in the United States after having learned from the UberLyft experience. And what's interesting is you have the federal government now leading with like the $50 million Smart Cities Challenge, which was $40 million from the federal government and $10 million from Vulcan, which is Paul Allen of Microsoft, his company's money. So they are basically giving $50 million to one city to institute smart city technologies, ranging from sensors and digital wayfinding, Wi-Fi and so forth, to autonomous vehicles. And so I think that I'm very excited actually about what the future holds in terms of public-private partnership in this area around technology. And I think that if we do this right, if we test the waters properly, if we, as I talk about in the book, if we have shared risks and shared rewards, shared incentives and shared outcomes, I think that we can really serve the citizenry better than we have in the past, where often we do a big RFP from the public sector to the private sector and then try to negotiate a contract on both sides that screws the other side. Or we just fight off the innovation because we want to protect a monopoly, like a taxi, for instance. And so I think that there's been a recognition in the U.S. at the federal level, increasingly at the state and at the city level, that the key to a sustainable urban future is actually going to be through these public-private partnerships. Well, coming back to the UberLyft example, the government and the private sector went at it, and they argued, and they fought. And ultimately what's happened, I think, is that the customer has won. I think that we need the private sector to be more focused on working for the greater good and not just focusing on profit. So basically taking a triple bottom line approach to business: people, planet, profit. If you do that, I think you'll have a business that's more sustainable in the long term. One of the things that we suffer from in the United States, particularly in corporate America, is a focus on quarter-to-quarter profits, particularly if you're a publicly traded company. And I think that does not necessarily serve the citizenry at large. And so pure capitalism, completely unchecked, can be dangerous. And a dictatorship on the government side can be problematic, obviously. Although I joke that a benevolent dictatorship can be very good. But I'm just kidding. So by having this triple bottom line approach to business, and by having a government that's more focused on return on investment and actually covering their costs, which, by the way, is one of the things that the Singapore government, I think, does extremely well, that we could all take a lesson from in other parts of the world, then I think it's easier for the two to work together. And so I think actually in Singapore, without knowing everything about Singapore, being a visitor, it seems that there is an openness. The MRT is a great example where, yes, the government capitalizes it, but then they hand it off to the private sector to operate. And guess what? It operates profitably. That's very unusual. In the rest of the world, I mean, there's Hong Kong and there's Singapore, and I don't think I'm aware, because I didn't know about Singapore until I got here, I don't think I'm aware of another system in the world that's profitable. Or at least breaks even. So I would say that you guys are actually setting an example here, not that it can't be improved upon. This is great. I mean, I think that even at the municipal level, the government itself were applying the tactical urbanism tactics because the state didn't agree with us. Or in some cases, the federal government didn't agree with us. And I think what's happened in the United States is that mayors are the most accountable to their constituents directly, and council members, people at the city level, for outcomes. And because of that, there is little patience anymore for waiting for the state to approve what you want to do on a state road, or waiting for government funding from the feds for 10 years for a light rail system. And so at the municipal level, there's much more focus on, like, how do we fund this ourselves? How do we get the return to where we need it to be so that we go out to the bond market, we finance it, and we build it? And when it comes to individuals, I think there's much more citizen involvement and interest in the way our streets operate, look, and feel, how safe they are. And that's a wonderful thing. I think it's a sign of democracy working. And like our Make Way for People program in Chicago, which was meant to reinvent public spaces, alleys, parking spaces, plazas, and activate them, we would partner with local groups in the community, typically business improvement groups, and we would basically remove the red tape and give them simple design standards to follow so that they could do it. They would put the money in, they'd get it done. They'd work with the citizenry. And so I think there are ways to do this in an organized way so it's not just somebody out on the street spraying a bike lane. And I think often when you do have that going on, it's because the government is not responding, and they're not giving good answers, or they're not acting in the time frame that's needed. And so the citizens are like, well, we're just going to do it ourselves. And I think the government needs to wake up, because it's easy to feel like you operate in a monopoly. I mean, it is, right? But I think, like we learned with Uber, transportation's it can't be monopolized if a better quality service can be provided by somebody else. And I think with public space, we have to remember that ultimately its ownership resides with the taxpayer, and that we are here as stewards, and we are here to guide the decisions of the government in their favor. Now, where it gets complicated is when we have cultural issues where you have caused a situation where people think that something's good for them that's not. And I'll give an example. We need 8-lane one-way streets in LA or New York or here. And the government may have to stand up and say, well, we're not going to do that anymore, even though the public wants it by and large. Maybe it's 55% of people, because it goes against our sustainability goals. People are dying in the streets. They're getting run over by cars. We know that it's bad for our businesses. And so there are times when the government's actually got to stand up and be strong and say, well, some of you don't understand. And that's where it gets tough and complicated. And I worked for 2 mayors, which I talk about in the book, who were open to doing the unpopular thing if they knew it was right. And they'd either seen it work somewhere else and sort of knew that the long-term benefits outweighed the short-term political risk. And so balancing that one's tough. But the dialogue in many ways is the most important thing. So you may dialogue between the government and the private sector and have a lot of arguments, but at least that dialogue's happening. And you'd be surprised, you change a lot of people's minds if you're actually right, including about things like, bike share or pedestrian crossings instead of what you have out here in front of the building, where even like I was with all the leaders of the agencies and we all had to cross illegally and hope we didn't get run over by a scooter. Yeah, so when I joined government coming from business, I was surprised how opaque the agency was and that everything was done behind closed doors. And you had sort of left brain people and right brain people. So you had the creative planners that were going out and talking to the community and saying, oh yeah, we can do that. And then you had the engineers saying, no, we can't do that behind closed doors. And so you had an end product that was very different than from what we sold people. And I was like, we can't do that. And you also had a lot of backdoor communications, back channeling is a better term, with the council members and other elected officials. And so we made a conscious effort to open the agency up. And it made the left brain people uncomfortable. But it was the right thing to do. And I think that if you're going to convince a customer that a product or service is good for them, you've got to actually explain the feature, advantage, benefit of that product or service. And so whether it was a streetscape project or the bike share program that we launched or expansion of bus service or whatever it was, we were going to go out there and have a healthy dialogue and communication, put out in front of them what our goals were. Not that, oh, we want to move more people, because honestly, most people don't care about that. What they care about is, how does this affect my quality of life? How does this make my kids safer? The air cleaner, save me time, save me money, save me hassle, right? And so I took more of a business approach to communication. Doesn't mean that we were formalizing things and making it really rigid and we were like, running commercials, although we did run some commercials. But it meant like we were adding social media back in 2008, 9, 10, when the government wasn't doing a lot of that. We were communicating with people two-way. We were taking all of our projects and uploading them onto a website, and every week updating them with all the things we're doing well and not doing well. We put out these action agendas, 2 in each city, where we said we commit to do these 150 things over the next 24 months, not a 10-year plan with nobody accountable for the outcomes, which is often what you would see. No, we're taking a master plan and a long-range plan, and then we're taking what we think can actually be manifested over the next 24 months, and we're committing to it. And then we'd report on it 2 years later. And we would put like, whoops, failed here, didn't get it done. But then here we really exceeded our goal, so here we're going to recommit, or you know what, we're going to throw that goal out because it's not realistic. But whatever it was that happened, we were transparent about it. And we even started our own blog so we could communicate directly with people. And all of these efforts paid off in people feeling like they were much more a part of the process, I think, feeling like they had a voice. Even if we told them, well, no, we're not going to do that, we responded. And often government wasn't even responsive. It would just go into a black hole. But if you're on Twitter and somebody keeps tweeting at you, you have to respond. And I would respond personally to people. So I think that sent a message to the public that this is a new day in government. And it's very important, particularly if you're going to have an aggressive initiative. Let's say you want to become the most bikeable, walkable city in Asia, which I think you should. There's a long way to go, but you could do it by involving the public, committing to it publicly, breaking it up into all the milestones, month by month, year by year. Much better chance you're going to get there, because then people internally who are responsible for getting it done are going to be publicly out there, right? I used to always joke with my team, public humiliation is a great motivator, as well as a big public pat on the back when you're successful. I think commitment is very important. So I've already talked about some of the tools to get you there, publicly putting the goals out there. But I think committing in terms of committing the funds, committing in terms of leadership from the top, publicly stating we're going to do this and we're going to accomplish it. I think iterating is important. So not just saying, hey, it's 2016 and by 2030 we're going to have this done, but saying by 2016 and a half we'll have this done, by January 2017 this, and really break it down. I think to commit to listening to the public and allowing them to weigh in on what they like and they don't like. But fundamentally, there's no reason not to get shit done. It's much more fun. Your staff will be much happier achieving things rather than just talking about doing things. And actually, Singapore's got such a rich history, by the way, of getting things done. And like Washington, D.C., you have a vertically integrated government, but much more so in that it's the country and the city. And so your ability to move fast is unparalleled in many ways. And so the things that I did in 2 years, you should be able to get done in 12 months. Seriously. And you're a very wealthy society. What takes a long time is the cultural shift. For instance, it's warm here. Getting somebody on a bike or walking when they're used to, like, hey, I'm of a certain social class, I drive a BMW in the air conditioning, that's going to take a little bit of time. And that's why starting sooner is very important, because the culture change is often the long pole in the tent. Let's see. Cycling gives you a lot of energy.
Literally, okay.
Exercise. Well, actually, it's true. I was talking to one of your leaders today, he's the chief planner, I think, and he rides like 16 kilometers a day, and he's full of energy. So I think being very active, I think caring about the issues. And for me, and I'm going to open up my presentation this afternoon by talking about what motivates me. And I used to feel like I did the work that I did, whether it was in the public or private sector, because I was passionate about it and for other people's children. Now that I have a daughter, and soon another daughter, and we almost didn't have kids because we felt like we didn't want to bring kids into a world that wasn't going to be as good as the world that we lived in. And it still very much concerns me, but I think humans are amazing, and I think if we put our minds to it, we can pull the planet out of this spiral that we're in. And so I'm very hopeful, actually, and I'm hopeful for the next generation. And I think they're, in many ways, a little more pragmatic than the baby boomers and even some Gen Xers. So I'd like to think that we can affect really positive change.